The wind came off the water before sunrise, threading through the gaps in the buildings along Pioneer Square, carrying with it the smell of rain and diesel and the particular cold that belonged only to Seattle in November, the kind that did not simply touch the skin, but pressed against it slow and deliberate, as though testing how much a person could endure. Claire Henson had been enduring it for 3 years. She sat on the wooden bench near the edge of the walkway, her coat pulled tight across her chest, her hands tucked beneath her arms. The bench had no plaque, no memorial, no reason to be remembered. But Claire had come to know it the way a person comes to know any place they return to out of necessity rather than choice. She knew which boards creaked. She knew which angle of the backrest gave the least discomfort after a long night. She knew that the street light above it flickered twice every hour, at 20 past and 20 to so reliably that she had stopped noticing it altogether. Noah sat beside her close enough that she could feel the warmth of his small body through the layers of fabric between them. He was 10 years old and he had his father's dark eyes and his mother's way of going very still when he was thinking hard about something. He wore a faded blue jacket that had come from a donation bin at the shelter on 4th Avenue, too large across the shoulders, the zipper stuck halfway, but he never complained about it. He had stopped complaining about things months ago, and Claire was not sure whether that was a sign of resilience or something quieter and more troubling that she did not have the words to examine yet. He was holding a paper bag carefully in both hands, the way a person holds something they understand to be fragile. Inside the bag was half a sandwich. Wheat bread, turkey, a smear of mustard. It had come from the morning distribution at the Lighthouse Mission, 4 blocks east, handed through a window by a woman with tired eyes and a genuine smile, one of those rare combinations that Claire had learned to recognize and be grateful for. The sandwich had been whole when they received it. Noah had torn it carefully in half while they walked. He took a small bite, chewed slowly, then looked up at her. Mom. His voice was low, shaped by the particular seriousness that children adopt when they are trying to sound like adults. Do you want the other half? Claire felt the familiar tightening in her chest. It was not hunger, though. Hunger was also present. It was something else, the specific ache of watching your child try to take care of you, the love in it and the weight of it arriving at the same moment. You eat it, sweetheart. She kept her voice easy, unhurried. I'm not hungry this morning. Noah studied her face. He had always been a careful observer, even as a very small child. He would sit in his high chair and watch the room with a patience that seemed to belong to someone much older, his dark eyes moving from face to face as though cataloging information for later use. You didn't eat yesterday either, he said. I had coffee at the mission. Coffee isn't food. It counts in the morning. He looked at her for another moment, unconvinced, then slowly brought the other half of the sandwich to his mouth. Claire watched him eat and said nothing. She had learned that the most important lies a mother tells are the ones told without any words at all. The slight adjustment of expression, the deliberate relaxation of the jaw, the eyes that say everything is fine when everything is not fine, has not been fine for a very long time, may not be fine for a very long time still. She had become fluent in that particular language. Around them, the city was waking up. Office workers crossed the square with coffee cups and the distracted energy of people whose problems were different in kind from hers. A delivery truck idled at the corner, its exhaust rising in the cold air. Pigeons moved along the wet pavement in their mechanical, unhurried way, indifferent to everything. The sky above the buildings was the color of old pewter, heavy and low, the kind of sky that does not threaten rain so much as simply deliver it quietly and without drama, because it has nowhere else to be. Claire had once been part of that other world, the one where you carried a coffee cup and walked with purpose and had somewhere specific to go. 10 years ago, it felt closer to another lifetime. She had worked as an assistant accountant at a small firm called Hartwell Associates, 3 blocks from the waterfront. The office had frosted glass doors and a coffee machine that produced something approximating espresso and a view of the sound that she had genuinely loved, though she had rarely paused long enough to look at it properly. She had been the kind of employee people described as dependable. She arrived early, stayed late when it was needed, learned the systems faster than her supervisor expected, and asked good questions in the right moments. It was not a glamorous career. It was not the life she had imagined when she was younger. But it was hers and it was stable, and in the years before everything changed, she had believed that stability was enough. that it was in fact the thing most worth protecting. She had been married then, to a man named Daniel who had sandy hair and a good laugh, and a habit of leaving his keys in every pocket except the one he checked first. They had met at a mutual friend's birthday party in Fremont, talked for 4 hours without noticing the time, and been together from that night forward with the kind of ease that makes a person believe the whole thing was inevitable. They had rented a small apartment in Capitol Hill old building, unreliable elevator windows that fogged in winter and furnished it slowly piece by piece from secondhand stores and end-of-season sales, and it had felt like exactly the right way to build a life. Then Noah was born, and the world reorganized itself around his face. She still remembered the exact weight of him in her arms in the delivery room, the warmth of him, the specific quality of his first sound, not quite a cry, more like an announcement. Daniel had stood beside the bed with tears on his face and said in a voice she had never heard him use before or since, "He has your eyes." She had laughed and said, "That was impossible, newborns all look the same," and Daniel had said, "No, look at him. He's looking at things the way you do." She had looked, and she had understood exactly what he meant. Those first years were hard in the way that good things are sometimes hard, full of exhaustion and uncertainty and the constant low hum of responsibility, but also full of something that required no name because it was simply present evident in the smallest moments. Noah learning to walk, falling, looking up at her with an expression of pure scientific curiosity rather than distress. Noah at 3 arranging his toy cars in precise lines, and then sitting back to consider them with his head tilted to one side. Noah at 5 asking her why the sky was a different color at the edges than in the middle, and not accepting any answer that did not make complete logical sense. She had not noticed when Daniel started to change. That was the thing she had turned over most often in the 3 years since, not the ending itself, but the failure to perceive its approach. The longer hours, the new distance in his eyes at dinner, the phone calls taken in the hallway with the door pulled almost shut. She had constructed explanations. Work stress, a difficult project, the ordinary frictions of a marriage entering its middle years. She had been so committed to those explanations that she had not let herself consider the alternative until the evening Daniel sat down across from her at the kitchen table and said in the voice of someone who has rehearsed a thing too many times and made it wooden in the process, "I need to talk to you about something." She had known before he said another word. "I met someone else." 4 words. She had counted them afterward in the sleepless hours that followed. 4 words in a decade of accumulated life began the process of reorganizing itself into something she did not yet have the shape of. The divorce was civil, which meant it was still devastating, but conducted with a kind of administrative restraint that sometimes made it feel worse rather than better. Daniel moved out. His income disappeared from their shared account. Claire's salary, which had always been adequate within the context of 2 people sharing a household, became inadequate almost immediately within the context of one person managing a mortgage and childcare on their own. She worked longer hours. She took on freelance bookkeeping for small businesses on evenings and weekends, sitting at the kitchen table after Noah was asleep, the apartment quiet around her, her eyes moving across columns of numbers until they blurred. She managed for 2 years. Then Hartwell Associates closed a casualty of a broader financial contraction that eliminated firms like theirs without malice or drama simply because the numbers no longer worked. She found other positions, a temporary contract here, a part-time placement there, but nothing with the stability she needed, and the gaps between grew longer. The savings she had built eroded with a speed that still felt impossible when she thought about it, as though money possessed a form of gravity that reversed itself completely under certain conditions, pulling everything downward at once. The landlord had been kind about it, which somehow made it harder. She still remembered packing the last box. Noah had been 6. He had stood in the middle of the empty living room looking at the walls where the pictures had been and said with perfect practicality, "Are we moving to a new house?" And she had said yes, keeping her voice steady, keeping her face arranged in the expression that said everything is fine because he was 6 and she was his mother, and that was what she had to offer him in that moment. The truth that the next place they would sleep was a shelter with metal bunk beds and a roll about the maximum number of consecutive nights was a thing she carried alone, as she had learned to carry most things. 3 years of carrying, she was 38 years old and she was sitting on a bench in Pioneer Square, watching her son eat half a sandwich with the careful attention of a child who understood without being told directly that this was not a moment to be wasteful. She was thinking about the day, about the mission's lunch schedule, about whether the library on Fifth would have space this afternoon, about the particular problem of shoes, because Noah's left sneaker was beginning to separate at the sole, and she had not yet found a solution when Noah went very still beside her. "Mom," his voice had changed, quieter, more careful. "What is it?" "That man is looking at us." She followed his gaze without turning her head, fully a small survival skill she had developed over the past 3 years, the ability to assess her surroundings with minimal visible movement. A man in a postal uniform stood near the edge of the path, perhaps 20 feet away. He was holding a small stack of envelopes and looking at a piece of paper in his other hand, then looking up at the benches around the square with the expression of someone who is certain they are in the right place, but cannot reconcile that certainty with what they are actually seeing. He looked at her. He looked back at his paper. He walked toward them. Claire straightened slightly. Beside her, she felt Noah do the same. "Excuse me," the man said. He was perhaps 50, with a weathered face and the careful manner of someone who had spent decades navigating other people's complicated moments. "I'm sorry to bother you. Are you—" He looked at his paper again as though confirming something he already knew. "Are you Claire Henson?" The question landed strangely. Claire could not have explained exactly why, except that certain phrases carry a weight that has nothing to do with their individual words, and this was one of them. The fact of her name spoken by a stranger in a place where she had no address, no forwarding information, no way to be found. "Yes," she said, "I am." The postal worker looked at her face for a moment, then looked at the envelope in his hand, then held it out toward her. "This letter is addressed to you. He paused, selecting his words with visible care. "I've been trying to locate you for a few days. The law firm that sent it indicated you might be in this area." Claire reached out and took the envelope. Her fingers registered the weight of it before her eyes had properly processed what she was looking at: a cream-colored envelope, heavier than ordinary mail, the kind used for formal correspondence, the kind associated with legal documents in official matters in situations that required a particular quality of paper to signal their seriousness. Her name was typed across the front. Claire Henson. No address beneath it. "Who's it from?" Noah asked. He had leaned forward slightly, his half-eaten sandwich forgotten in his hands. Claire turned the envelope over. In the upper left corner was the name of a law firm, Briggs & Calloway, with a Seattle address she did not recognize. She did not open it immediately. She sat with it in her hands for a moment, feeling its weight, trying to understand what category of thing it might be before she knew what it actually was. In her experience, unexpected legal correspondence arrived in two varieties: things that were bad and things that were mistakes. She was trying to determine which this was likely to be when Noah said quietly, "Mom, just open it." She opened it. Inside was a single sheet of heavy paper folded in thirds, covered in the precise typography of a legal firm's letterhead. She unfolded it. She read the first paragraph. She read it again. She looked up at the gray Seattle sky for a moment, at nothing in particular, and then she looked back at the bind and read it a third time, because the third time confirmed what the first two times had told her, which was that she had not misread it. "Mom." Noah's voice was very careful. "What does it say?" Claire lowered the letter slowly to her lap. She was aware of the postal worker standing a few feet away, of the pigeons moving along the wet pavement, of the distant sound of the delivery truck pulling away from the corner. She was aware of all of it, and none of it simultaneously, the way the mind sometimes separates itself from its immediate surroundings when it needs space to process something that does not yet make complete sense. It says she began and then stopped and then started again. It says that a man named Earl Mackay passed away 2 weeks ago. She paused. It says he was my grandfather. Noah blinked. He looked at her with the careful attention he reserved for things that seemed to require extra calibration. "You have a grandfather. I had one." She looked at the letter again. "I never met him." This was true, and it was also, she understood, an incomplete description of the situation. The fuller truth was that Earl Mackay had been, for as long as Claire could remember, a subject that did not exist in her family. Not a painful subject, not a forbidden one exactly, but simply absent, a door that had been closed so long ago that the outline of it had become invisible. She had asked about him once, precisely once, when she was 12 years old. She had been sitting at the dinner table with her father, a quiet man who communicated primarily through silences of varying quality, and she had said, "Dad, where does your father live?" Her father had set down his fork. He had looked at her with an expression that was not anger exactly, but was adjacent to it, the look of a person who has organized their inner life around a particular arrangement of facts and does not welcome disruption of that arrangement. Some island, he had said. Why doesn't he ever visit? Because he chose that island over his family. A pause. That's the end of it. It had been the end of it. For 26 years, Earl Mackay had been a closed door, and Claire had learned not to look for the outline. But the letter was not finished. Her eyes moved down the page past the formal language about the estate, past the references to documentation and legal process, and landed on the final paragraph. She read it. She read it again. She became very still. Mom. Noah's voice had shifted into a different register, the one he used when he sensed that something significant was happening and did not yet know whether it was good or bad. What else does it say? Claire looked up at him. She was aware that her face was doing something she was not fully in control of, some combination of expressions that she would not have been able to name precisely, but that must have been visible to her son because he leaned forward another inch. It says, she said, keeping her voice as steady as she could manage, that in his will he left me something. What is it? She looked at the letter one more time. Then she turned it so that Noah could see the final lines, the ones she had read 3 times and still could not entirely reconcile with the bench she was sitting on, the cold air, the paper bag in her son's hands, the ordinary, impossible morning. A property, she said. Like a house. Claire shook her head slowly. Her voice, when she found it again, was barely above a murmur. Not a house, she pointed to the line. It says he left us an island. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The wind moved through the trees at the edge of the square. A bus groaned past on the street. The pigeons rearranged themselves along the pavement in a pattern that meant nothing and suggested nothing, and was simply the ordinary motion of ordinary birds on an ordinary morning that had, without any warning whatsoever, become something else entirely. Noah stared at the letter. Then he looked at his mother. Then he looked at the letter again, as though the second look might clarify something the first had not. An island, he said. An island. He sat back against the bench. A slow, wondering expression moved across his face, the particular expression of a 10-year-old encountering something that falls entirely outside the categories he has been given for understanding the world. Then, with the uncomplicated logic of a child who has not yet learned to be suspicious of good fortune, he said, "Maybe he knew we needed it." Claire folded the letter carefully. She slid it back into its cream-colored envelope and held it against her chest for a moment, one hand flat against the paper. She did not know what to say to that. She was not certain her son was wrong. The phone call with Mr. Briggs happened that afternoon from a borrowed cell phone in the library on Fifth Avenue. Claire sat in a corner chair near the window with Noah doing reading exercises at a table 20 feet away, and she listened to the measured professional voice of a man who had clearly made many phone calls like this one and understood that the people on the other end of them were always in some form of shock, regardless of how calm they sounded. "Miss Henson," Mr. Briggs said, "I want to be very clear with you. The will has been fully verified and properly executed. There is no ambiguity in it. The island, Mackay Island, listed in the county records under that name since 1994, belongs to you now in its entirety, along with all structures and contents on the property." "How large is it?" Claire asked. The question surprised her slightly, as though some practical part of her brain had decided to start gathering concrete information in the absence of any other available response. "Approximately 40 acres. Forested. One structure, a cabin your grandfather built sometime in the early 1990s. There is a small dock on the western inlet." She looked across the library at Noah, who was bent over his book with his index finger moving slowly under the words. "Mr. Briggs, why would he leave this to me? He didn't know me. I never met him." There was a pause, not a hesitation exactly, more the pause of a man who is choosing between two true things and selecting the one that is appropriate to share. "Miss Henson," he said carefully, "I've been handling Mr. Mackay's affairs for the past 11 years. I can tell you that he was a man who thought about things for a very long time before acting on them. The language in his will is specific. You are named directly, and the reasoning, to the extent that any client shares their reasoning with their attorney, was another pause, deliberate. What does that mean? It means, Mr. Briggs said that he knew who you were. More than that, I can't properly say. But I think the island itself may answer some of your questions better than I can. She thought about that for a long time after the call ended. She sat in the library chair while Noah read, and she turned the sentence over in her mind the way a person turns a stone over to see what is underneath it. He knew who you were. The ferry terminal was a 40-minute bus ride north of the city on a stretch of coast where the buildings gave way to working docks, and the air tasted different, cleaner and older, at the same time weighted with salt and the particular smell of wood that has spent decades absorbing ocean weather. Claire and Noah arrived in the early morning 2 days after the letter, each carrying a single bag. The law firm had arranged temporary accommodation and logistical support, a detail that had been delivered with such professional matter-of-factness that Claire had spent considerable time afterward trying to understand how it was possible that her life, which had been entirely without logistics for 3 years, now had a firm of attorneys arranging them on her behalf. The ferry terminal was small: a dock, a covered waiting area, a hand-painted sign. 2 other passengers were waiting: an older woman with a canvas bag full of groceries, a young man with surveying equipment who looked like he had made this trip many times before. The captain was a man named Aldrich Fenn. He was perhaps 70, with the particular weathered quality of someone who has spent most of their life outdoors, in a climate that does not reward vanity, and he had the eyes of a person who notices things without necessarily commenting on them. He looked at Claire when she gave her name. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression. "You're the one who inherited Earl's place," he said. It was not a question. "Yes." Fenn looked at her for another moment, then at Noah, then out at the water. "I'll take you across. Tide's good right now." He turned back to the wheelhouse. "Come aboard." The trip took just under an hour. The sound stretched wide around them, gray-green, under the low clouds, interrupted by islands that rose from the water at irregular intervals. Dark shapes covered in pine, some with visible structures, most without. Noah stood at the railing for most of the crossing, watching the islands pass with the kind of concentrated attention he gave to things he was genuinely trying to understand. Claire stood beside him, one hand on the railing, and did not try to fill the silence. After perhaps 20 minutes, she made her way to the wheelhouse. Fenn glanced at her without turning fully. "You knew him?" she asked. "My grandfather knew of him is probably more accurate. He'd come into the terminal every month or so for supplies. Quiet man, polite, never said much about himself." A pause. Kept his own company. What did people think of him? Fenn considered this. Most folks thought he was strange, moving to an island alone, keeping himself apart. There are people around here who've done the same for perfectly ordinary reasons, wanting quiet, getting older, that kind of thing. But with Earl, there was always the sense that the solitude wasn't a preference, more like a decision. What kind of decision? Fenn was quiet for a moment, watching the water ahead. "The kind a man makes when he's carrying something," he said finally, "and he doesn't want anyone else to have to carry it with him." Claire looked at the horizon. Somewhere out there among the dark shapes rising from the water was a piece of land that now had her name attached to it. She was still trying to understand what that meant, not legally, not practically, but in the deeper sense. What it meant that a stranger who shared her blood had looked at her life from some unknown distance and decided that she was the right person to receive whatever he was leaving behind. Fenn pointed ahead and slightly to the left. "That one there." McKay Island rose from the water at a slight angle higher than the surrounding islands, its tree line dense and dark against the pale sky. From a distance, it looked completely uninhabited, no visible structures, no cleared land, no evidence of human presence beyond the narrow wooden dock extending from a small inlet on the western shore. As they came closer, the dock became clearer, and beyond it, partly hidden by the tall pines, the outline of a structure. "There's a cabin," Noah said. "Your grandfather built it," Fenn said. He slowed the engine as they approached. "About 30 years ago by my reckoning. Before my time on this run, but I've seen it from the water plenty. Never seen the light on in all the years I've been crossing." "He lived there in the dark." Fenn almost smiled. "Didn't say that. Said I never saw the light." He brought the boat gently alongside the dock. Maybe he was just careful about what he let show. The dock creaked under their weight as they stepped onto it. The wood was old but solid, maintained, Claire realized, with more care than its weathered appearance suggested. She ran her hand along the railing as they walked toward shore. The wood had been treated recently enough that the grain was still sealed against the weather. Someone had been looking after this place. The path from the dock to the cabin was narrow and slightly overgrown at the edges, but clear in the center, the path of a person who had walked it many times and knew its every variation. The trees on either side were tall and close, the kind of forest that has been growing without interruption for a very long time, and the sound changed as they moved beneath them. The wind dropping away, the water's noise receding, the world becoming quieter and more contained. The cabin appeared gradually, the way things in deep forests often do, emerging from the background as the eye learns to separate it from the trees. It was a single-story structure built from dark timber with a covered porch and two windows facing the path. The roof had a particular quality that Claire recognized after a moment as careful maintenance, the kind of roof that looked old because it was old but had not been allowed to deteriorate past a certain point. Noah stopped on the path and looked at it. "It doesn't look abandoned," he said. "No," Claire agreed. "I thought it would." She had thought so too. When she had imagined the cabin, and she had imagined it many times over the past 2 days, lying awake in the shelter, the ceiling above her unfamiliar and low, she had pictured something nature had been reclaiming. Windows dark with grime, boards warped by seasons of neglect, the particular sadness of a place that had been stopped in time. This was not that. The windows were dusty, yes. The wood of the porch had the silver quality of weathered timber. But beside the cabin's north wall stood a woodshed, and in the woodshed, Claire could see this from the path, firewood had been stacked with the kind of precision that does not happen by accident. Log set against log, the lines level, the pieces uniformly split. Not the stack of a man who simply needed heat. The stack of a man who found order in the activity and had pursued it with attention. Noah climbed the porch steps, carefully testing each one. He turned back to look at Claire. "Should we knock?" She almost laughed. The instinct was so perfectly correct, the human reflex toward courtesy, even in circumstances where it made no logical sense. She climbed the steps beside him. "It's ours technically," she said. The word ours felt strange in her mouth. She could not remember the last time she had used it in reference to a place. She pushed the door open. The hinges moved without protest recently. Oiled, she registered automatically the kind of detail that settled into her awareness without her having to look for it. Inside the cabin was a single large room that resolved itself as her eyes adjusted: a wooden table with two chairs, a stone fireplace with a small stack of birch logs beside it, shelves along one wall filled with books and what appeared to be notebooks and binders, a narrow hallway leading to what she assumed were sleeping quarters. A large map of the surrounding coastline was pinned to the far wall with 4 tacks, its edges slightly curled. Everything was where it should be. That was the first impression. Not opulent, not comfortable in any particularly deliberate way, but arranged with intention, each object in a relationship to the others that made a kind of sense, the way things are arranged by someone who lives alone and knows where everything is and has organized the space for themselves rather than for visitors. But there was something else. Claire walked slowly to the table and placed her hand flat on the surface. The wood was cool. She lifted her palm and looked at her hand. A thin film of dust, but thin, the kind that accumulates over days, not over the weeks, since Earl McKay had died in a hospital bed somewhere on the mainland. And "Mom." Noah was standing near the window that faced north toward the woodshed. He was looking out at something. She came to stand beside him. Through the glass, the woodshed was clearly visible. And now from this angle, she could see what had not been visible from the path, that the woodshed was not only stacked neatly at the front, but had been recently restocked. The wood at the top of the stack was paler than the wood below it. Fresh cuts, lighter color. The pale interior of timber that has not yet had time to weather to gray. Someone had been here after Earl died. Someone had stacked new wood. Noah turned to look at her. He did not say what they were both thinking, but his eyes asked the question, and she had no answer for it yet. She moved instead toward the shelves, scanning the spines of the books. Marine biology, oceanography, environmental chemistry. Texts that had the worn spine quality of books that had been read more than once, consulted and returned and consulted again. Interspersed among them were binders, dozens of them arranged chronologically by year, from what she could see running from the mid-1990s forward. And the notebooks hardbound, the same model repeated across years, filled with the kind of dense handwriting she could see through the covers where they were thinner. A man's entire working life, she thought, preserved on these shelves, organized and maintained, waiting. And then she saw the map. She walked to it. It covered a large section of the Pacific Northwest coastline, with particular detail in the areas near the San Juan Islands and the waters north toward the Canadian border. Someone Earl, she assumed, had marked it in red pen. Small circles at irregular intervals along the coastline, each with a date written beside it in handwriting that was small and precise and absolutely legible. She was still studying the map when Noah said from across the room, "Mom, come here." He was crouching near the center of the floor, his head tilted to one side, his hand flat against one of the wooden boards. "What is it? This part sounds different." She crossed to him and crouched beside him. He knocked on the board with his knuckles, a clear, solid sound. Then he moved his hand 6 inches and knocked again. The sound changed, not dramatically, but enough. The particular resonance of wood above empty space rather than solid foundation. Claire pressed her own palm to the board. She ran her fingers slowly along its edges, feeling for something she was not yet sure she was looking for. She found it near the north edge, a groove. Shallow, deliberately inconspicuous, but there a channel cut into the wood just wide enough for a finger. She looked at Noah. He looked at her. She slid her finger into the groove and lifted. The board came up, cleanly rotating on a hidden hinge at its far end, revealing a rectangular opening in the floor, perhaps 18 inches across and 2 feet long. The space below was dark, the darkness of a compartment built between floor joists, deliberate and enclosed. Claire reached for her phone, turned on the light, and directed it downward. Inside the compartment rested a metal box, approximately the size of a large hardcover book, perhaps 4 inches deep. The surface was scratched and dull with age, but the construction was solid, heavy gauge, metal-reinforced corners, a latch mechanism that looked functional. It had been set into the compartment with care, not dropped, not shoved, placed. Noah breathed quietly beside her. She reached in with both hands and lifted the box out. It was heavier than she expected. She set it on the floor between them. For a moment, neither of them moved. The cabin was absolutely still. Outside, the wind had dropped entirely, and the forest around them had gone quiet in the way that forests sometimes do without obvious reason, as though something large and attentive has paused to listen. "Go ahead," Noah said. His voice was almost a whisper. Claire unlatched the box and opened the lid. Inside were 3 objects. The first was a journal, hardbound, covered in dark brown leather, the cover worn smooth at the corners from years of handling. She lifted it. The weight of it was substantial. The weight of paper that has been written on page after page for a very long time. The second was a key, brass-old with a simple bow and a cut that suggested an interior lock of some kind. Not a modern key, the kind made to last. The third was an envelope, sealed with tape across the flap. The paper was heavy cream-colored, identical in quality to the envelope that had arrived in Pioneer Square. And across the front, in the same careful handwriting that she recognized from the legal correspondence without having seen it before, were 2 words: Claire Henson. She stared at her own name in her grandfather's handwriting. She had never seen his handwriting before this moment. She had no photograph of him, no letter, no object he had touched. He was in every practical sense a stranger, a name attached to a story she had been told once and then told not to ask about again. And yet here was her name written in his hand on an envelope that had been sealed and placed in a locked box beneath the floor of a cabin on an island she had not known existed 3 days ago. Noah was very still beside her. She picked up the envelope and turned it over. It had been sealed with tape rather than glue, a deliberate choice, she thought. A thing meant to be opened cleanly without destruction. She peeled the tape carefully and lifted the flap. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded in half. She unfolded it. The handwriting covered both sides, dense and steady, the writing of someone who had things to say and had spent a long time deciding exactly how to say them. She read the first line, then she read it again. Then she read it a third time because the third time was when the words stopped being words and became something else, a weight that settled somewhere in the center of her chest and changed the quality of the air in the room. She looked up at the ceiling of the cabin. She looked at the shelves of binders and books. She looked at the map on the wall with its red circles and careful dates. She looked at the brass key lying in the open metal box. Mom. Noah's voice was the quietest she had ever heard it. What does it say? She lowered the letter to her lap and looked at her son, his dark eyes, his father's eyes, watching her with the careful patience of a child who has learned not to rush what the world is not yet ready to deliver. It says, she began, and she had to stop and press her lips together for a moment before she could continue. It says that he watched my life from a distance for years. She paused. He knew about the divorce. He knew about losing the job. He knew about... She stopped. She looked at her son. He knew about the shelter, Noah. He knew where we've been. Noah was very still. He says he stayed away to protect us. Her voice was level. She had decided in the moment she began speaking that she owed her son the truth without the weight of her own reaction added to it. He found something 30 years ago, something that powerful people wanted to stay hidden, and when he tried to bring it to light, they threatened his family. He says, she looked at the page again. He says he chose to disappear from our lives so that we would never become a target because of what he knew. Noah looked at the journal still lying in the metal box. What did he find? Claire reached for the journal. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting was the same as the letter, dense, precise, each letter formed with deliberate care. The first entry was dated 1993. It began with a single line. She read it aloud quietly to her son. Today I found something I was not looking for, and I understand now that finding it has changed the direction of my life in a way I am not yet able to fully see. She looked at the binders on the shelves. She looked at the map on the wall. She looked at the brass key in the box, and then at the shelf behind which she was becoming increasingly certain a door existed that the key was intended to open. She thought of the man who had built this place, who had stacked firewood with precision and oiled door hinges and maintained a dock and organized 30 years of careful work on shelves that had waited for her, who had known her address without having one of his own to give her, who had watched her life from a distance and concluded in whatever calculus of love and fear and hope he had been working with that she was the right person to receive what he had spent 30 years protecting. She thought of the last line of his letter. She had not read it aloud to Noah yet. She read it to herself again now. I stayed away to keep you safe. Now I need you to be brave enough to finish what I couldn't. She folded the letter. She placed it carefully back in the envelope. She looked at her son, who was waiting with the patience of someone who has learned to wait. What did he leave us? Noah asked. It was the same question he had asked on the bench in Pioneer Square, and she had given him the answer that was true at the time in Island. But that answer felt different now, smaller, like the outer edge of something whose interior she was only beginning to perceive. She picked up the brass key from the box and held it in her palm. Its weight was precise and familiar in the way that objects made for a specific purpose are familiar. It fit naturally in the hand because it had been made to be carried. She looked toward the tall bookshelf against the far wall. She had registered it when they first entered, had cataloged it as a bookshelf and moved on. But now she looked at it differently. The way it sat slightly away from the wall, the way the books on its lowest shelf were arranged with a gap at one end, not a gap left by a missing book, but a gap left by hands that needed room to grip. She stood up. Noah stood with her. She crossed to the shelf, wrapped both hands around its right side, and pulled. It moved on the floor with a sound that was less like furniture moving and more like something that has been designed to move smooth, controlled, the particular sound of weight on a concealed track. Behind it, set into the wall, was a door. Old wood, dark with age, fitted with a simple iron lock just below a handle worn smooth by 30 years of use. Noah looked at the key in her hand. He looked at the lock. He looked at his mother. He left us more than an island, Claire said quietly. She looked at the door and at the brass key in her hand and at the binders on the shelves and at the map with its red circles, and she understood with a clarity that felt less like discovery and more like recognition that what she was standing at the edge of was not an ending. It was a beginning. The key fit the lock on the first try. Claire had half expected resistance, the kind of mechanical stubbornness that old locks develop after years of disuse, the pins seizing the cylinder refusing to turn. But the lock moved with the same quiet precision as everything else in this cabin. Everything Earl McKay had built, or maintained, or touched. The cylinder rotated smoothly. The bolt retracted. The door swung inward on hinges that made no sound at all. Behind it was a staircase, narrow wooden descending at a steep angle into darkness. The cold air that rose from below carried a particular quality, not the damp cold of a basement that has been sealed against water and losing the battle, but something drier and more deliberate. The cold of a space that had been designed to preserve. Claire stood at the top of the stairs for a moment, looking down into the dark. Noah stood beside her close enough that she could feel the slight pressure of his shoulder against her arm. He did not say anything. He had been doing this increasingly over the past hours, standing close, saying less, processing more. She recognized it as the same mode of attention he entered when something required him to think carefully before speaking, and she found it in this moment more comforting than she would have been able to explain. She pulled out her phone and turned on the light. The beam reached the bottom of the stairs and caught the edge of what lay beyond them. The corner of a wooden shelf, the dull gleam of a metal surface, the beginning of a space that was larger than the staircase suggested. "Stay right behind me," she said. They went down together. The stairs ended and the room opened around them, and for a moment Claire simply stood in the center of it and breathed. She had glimpsed shapes from the top of the stairs, the geometry of shelves, the dull gleam of metal containers, the edge of a workbench covered in canvas. But seeing something and understanding it were not the same thing, and the understanding arrived now slowly as her eyes moved through the space and her mind began to assemble what her eyes were telling it. 20 feet long, perhaps 12 feet wide. The ceiling low enough that she had to tilt her head slightly forward, though Noah beside her had no such problem. Along both long walls, wooden shelves ran from floor to ceiling, built from the same heavy timber as the cabin above, constructed with the same attention to permanence. A workbench occupied the center of the room, its surface covered with a large sheet of heavy canvas laid flat and deliberate over something that warranted of protection. She had come down these stairs expecting a storage space. What she was standing in was not a storage space. It was a laboratory, an archive, a fortress built for information. The first time she had moved through any space in this cabin, she had moved as a person collecting impressions. Now she moved as a person beginning to understand what the impressions added up to, and the sum was staggering. 25 years. The thought arrived with a specific gravity. Every object on these shelves represented time, not just the time to gather and document and preserve, but the time to remain committed to a purpose when no one was watching and no one was asking, and there was no guarantee the work would ever matter to anyone except the man doing it. He had done it anyway. She pulled the 1999 binder from the shelf, the earliest year she could find, and opened it to the first diagram. The symbol at the center of the page was one she had seen upstairs on the large wall map, repeated at irregular intervals along the coastline markings. She had not known what it meant then. She knew what it meant now because the diagram labeled it in 2 words: discharge point. She set the binder on the workbench and lifted one corner of the canvas sheet. Beneath it was a map much larger than the one on the wall upstairs, printed on paper, heavy and stiff with age, but still precise at the center. The coastline of Washington State in careful detail, with particular attention to the northwest waters and the scattered islands. The same red circles from the wall map, but here they were accompanied by coordinates, depth notations, directional arrows indicating current flow. And running through those notations, connecting them in a pattern that her accountant's eye recognized as the kind of pattern that only becomes visible when you are looking for it, a series of lines. Thin, drawn in blue ink, precise. She traced one with her finger from its origin point on the coastline northward through the water. The blue lines were pipelines, underground, running from points along the coastline into the open water. The red circles were collection sites where Earl had taken water samples, always downstream of the discharge points, always at specific depths, always at consistent intervals. The photographs stacked on the shelves were documentation of the discharge points themselves, shot at night with a long lens showing dark openings in rocky cliff faces where the pipes emerged below the waterline. And across every document, every binder, every photograph caption, the same name repeated without variation: Northville Maritime Corps. Noah had moved to the far end of the right wall. He was crouching in front of the lowest shelf, looking at something she could not yet see. "Mom, these are different from the others." She came to look. The bottles on the lowest shelf were larger than the water sample vials above them, sealed glass jars, each one containing a dark, viscous material that settled against the glass in layers of gray and brown. Each label had a location, a date, and a notation she recognized immediately from environmental chemistry, a hazard classification. These were not samples of the water that surrounded the discharge points. These were samples of the material being discharged. She stood up slowly. The shape of what Earl Mackay had spent 25 years building was fully visible to her now, the way a picture becomes visible when you find the correct distance from it. Every sample dated and located. Every discharge point photographed at multiple intervals across multiple seasons and years. Every financial document cross-referenced with the physical evidence. He had not simply collected evidence, he had built a case. A complete documented cross-referenced noise of the kind that a regulatory agency or a federal prosecutor could pick up and use without gathering a single additional piece of evidence. She pressed her hand flat against the workbench. The wood was solid under her palm. She was beginning to understand something deeper than the legal dimensions of what was in this room. She was beginning to understand why Earl Mackay had chosen the island not as an aesthetic, not as a retreat, but as the only available fortress. Because if he had stayed in the world, he had come from connected and visible, and present the company that had silenced him would have had instruments to use against him. His son, his daughter-in-law, the grandchild he had not yet met. Her father had said it as condemnation 26 years ago at a dinner table. He chose that island over his family. He had not chosen it over them. He had chosen it for them. She turned to look at Noah, who was sitting cross-legged on the floor of the underground room, turning one of the sealed water sample vials slowly in his hands, studying the label. "Noah," he looked up. "Your great-grandfather chose this island to protect us," she said, "not to leave us." Noah looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the vial in his hands. Then he looked at the rows of binders and the stacks of photographs and the hard drives on their bracket. "He protected all of this too," he said. "Yes, for us to find, for someone to find." She picked up the journal from where she had set it on the bottom stair. He said in his letter that he hoped the right person would find it. He hoped it would be me, but I think even if it hadn't been, even if the will had gone to someone else, or the letter had never reached me, this room would still be here. He would have found another way. Noah considered this with the seriousness it deserved. He sounds like someone who didn't give up. "No," Claire agreed quietly. "He doesn't." She was still holding the journal when she heard the sound from above. It came from outside the cabin, a low, even mechanical sound that did not belong to the forest or the water. She met Noah's eyes. He had heard it too. "Stay here," she said. She climbed the stairs quickly and crossed the cabin to the north-facing window. Through the dusty glass, a boat was turning into the inlet with the practiced ease of someone who had navigated it before. Not the ferry. This vessel was smaller and faster, its hull, a dark gray that made it look deliberate against the green-gray water. Two figures stood in it, dressed in a way that was incongruous with the island, dark coats, upright posture, the bearing of people who operated primarily indoors. She went back to the staircase door, pulled it closed, turned the brass key in the lock, and slid the bookshelf back into position with the same controlled movement she had used to open it. Then she set the journal on the table with a casualness she did not feel and went to stand near the fireplace. The knock at the door was 3 beats. Even unhurried, she opened it. The man on the porch was perhaps 55, with silver hair worn short and a face arranged through long practice into an expression of professional warmth. Behind him stood a second man, shorter, darker, wearing an expression that was not warm and had apparently never tried to be. He stood slightly back, the positioning of someone who is there to observe rather than participate. "Miss Henson," the first man said, "I hope we're not disturbing you." "You are," Claire said pleasantly, "but go ahead." Something moved in the man's eyes, a brief recalibration quickly concealed. "My name is Victor Holbrook. This is my associate, Roy Decker. We represent certain interests connected to this island and the surrounding area." She stepped back from the door. Having them inside was better than leaving them on the porch. Holbrook entered first. His eyes moved across the room with the economy of a person accustomed to assessing spaces quickly. He looked at the shelves of books. He looked at the map on the wall. He looked at the journal on the table. And at that last object, something shifted in his expression. Barely. A quarter second of attention before he looked away. He had recognized it. Decker came in behind him and stood near the door. He did not look at the room. He looked at Claire and then at Noah, who had positioned himself beside the fireplace. "What interests?" Claire said. Holbrook turned from the shelves with an easy gesture. "I represent a private investment group interested in this section of the coastline. When we learned the Mackay property had passed to a new owner, we felt it was worth reaching out." He reached into his coat pocket and removed a folded document. "We'd like to make you an offer for the island." Claire took it. She unfolded it. She read the number at the center of the page. It was a large number. Large enough that for a fraction of a second her brain did the thing it had been doing for 3 years, running calculations, converting figures into months of housing, weeks of food, Noah's shoes, and his winter coat. The number on the page could end all of that. She folded the document carefully. "Wow," she said. He tilted his head slightly. "I beg your pardon. Why this island? There are dozens of islands in this area with better infrastructure. Why are you interested in 40 acres of forest with a 30-year-old cabin?" Holbrook's smile remained in place. "Location, potential. The surrounding waters have developmental value that isn't immediately obvious." "I've just arrived," she said. She handed the document back. "I haven't had a chance to explore the property. I'm not in a position to make any decisions." Holbrook took the document. "Of course, take the time you need." He tucked it back into his coat. "But I would encourage you to consider your situation carefully, Miss Henson. A property like this, remote, without utilities, without reliable access, can become a significant burden, especially for someone who," he paused with practiced delicacy, "may not have the resources for long-term maintenance." "I appreciate your concern," she said. Decker spoke for the first time. His voice was lower than Holbrook's without warmth. "You should understand something about this island, Miss Henson. Properties with complicated histories have a way of becoming complicated problems. Sometimes the simplest solution is the cleanest one." Noah, from his position beside the fireplace, said clearly, "What does that mean?" Both men looked at him. Holbrook's smile shifted by a degree. "It means," Holbrook said to Noah with the particular tone adults use when speaking to a child, but meaning the words for the adult in the room, "that we're trying to make things easier for your mother." "She didn't say they were hard," Noah said. Claire placed a hand on her son's shoulder. She looked at Holbrook. "Thank you for coming. I'll be in touch if I decide I want to discuss it further." On the threshold, Holbrook paused and turned back. "One more thing, Miss Henson. Your grandfather was a solitary man. Men like that sometimes leave complicated legacies." A brief pause. "It's worth thinking carefully about what you're actually inheriting before you decide what to do with it." He stepped out. The door closed. Claire stood without moving until she heard the boat engine start below on the inlet. She crossed to the window and watched the gray vessel pull away, turn in the water, and move back out into the sound. Noah came to stand beside her, and "They knew about the journal," he said. She looked at him. "What makes you say that?" The way he looked at it when he came in, like he was checking whether it was still there. She had noticed the same thing. "How did they know we were here?" Noah asked. It was the right question. The answer, and she was beginning to construct it, was not reassuring. She picked up the journal and turned to the section dated 1997 and 1998, the period just before Earl had come to the island. She found the entry dated October of that year, written in a hand slightly less controlled than the earlier entries, still precise but with a pressure behind the pen that the earlier entries lacked. She read the relevant section aloud to Noah. "I reported the discharge evidence to the regional office in September. The case was assigned to a federal investigator named Decker. I provided him with the full set of samples and documentation I had gathered over the previous 5 years. He told me the investigation would proceed. 2 weeks later, I received a call from his supervisor telling me the case had been closed due to insufficient evidence. I do not believe the evidence was insufficient. I believe Roy Decker was the reason the case was closed, and I believe he was not acting alone. The following week, a man came to my house not to threaten me, he was too careful for that, but to make clear in specific terms what would happen to my work, my reputation, and the people connected to me if I continued pursuing the matter through official channels." She closed the journal. The room was quiet. The island had returned to its particular stillness, the wind in the pines, the water on the rocks. Decker, Noah said. That's the same person who was just here. Yes. He's the one who closed the case. Yes. Noah looked at the bookshelf against the far wall, the outline of the door behind it, at the room beneath it. So they knew about Grandpa's work all along, he said slowly, and they knew that if someone found it, it would be dangerous for them. Claire set the journal down. Yes. And now they know you're here. Yes. Noah thought about this for a long moment. Then he said with a practicality that reminded her uncomfortably of herself, then we need to make sure the evidence isn't only here. She looked at her son. He was 10 years old, working through the logical implications of a situation that would have been overwhelming to most adults, arriving at the correct conclusion with the same calm efficiency he brought to everything he decided deserved his full attention. Yes, she said, we do. That night, after Noah had fallen asleep, Claire sat at the wooden table with the journal open in front of her and worked methodically through the binders. She went through them one by one, not reading every page, but reading enough to understand the architecture of what Earl had built. The water samples were organized by location and year. The photographs were organized chronologically with location captions matching the coordinates on the underground map. The financial documents were printouts from regulatory filings and corporate disclosures annotated in Earl's hand, showing the discrepancy between what Northvale Maritime had reported to environmental agencies and what the water samples demonstrated they had actually been releasing. It was meticulous, it was comprehensive, and it was in the specific legal sense that mattered airtight. She worked until past midnight. Then she closed the last binder and sat for a moment in the quiet of the cabin. The fire burned down to coals. She thought about Victor Holbrook's face when he looked at the journal. She thought about Roy Decker's voice saying some things are better left buried. She thought about her grandfather at this same table working through these same documents, 30 years of nights, alone on this island, with no one to share the weight of what he knew. She thought about what he had written in his letter. I stayed away to keep you safe. Now I need you to be brave enough to finish what I couldn't. She understood now that this was the quality Earl had seen in her, not from birth, not from blood alone, but from what she had become in the years of losing things and refusing to be defined entirely by the loss. The quality that her grandfather had named in his letter with a word she had not used about herself in a very long time. Courage. She picked up the satellite phone she had found among Earl's equipment. It was old but functional, the kind used by researchers in areas without cell coverage. She turned it on. The battery was charged. She spent 20 minutes researching a name she had encountered 3 years ago, a journalist in Seattle known for investigative work on corporate malfeasance, whose articles she had read in the library during long afternoons waiting for Noah's shelter curfew to lift. Gwendolyn Reese. She sat with the number on the screen for a moment before she called. It rang twice. Then a woman's voice answered, alert, unhurried, the voice of someone accustomed to calls at unexpected hours. Reese? Claire looked at the window. Outside, the dark water of the sound caught the last light from a gap in the clouds, turning silver for a moment before the clouds closed again. My name is Claire Henson, she said. I'm sorry to call so late, but I have something I think you need to hear, and I don't think it can wait until morning. A brief pause. Then Gwendolyn Reese said, go ahead, and Claire began. Gwendolyn Reese arrived on the island 2 days later. She came on the morning ferry with Aldrich Fenn, standing at the bow with a canvas bag over one shoulder and a weatherproof case in her other hand, her gray hair pulled back against the wind off the water. She was perhaps 60, with the particular quality of someone who had spent decades in rooms where powerful people said things they later wished they had not said and had learned to carry that accumulation without being visibly weighted by it. She moved with economy. She looked at things directly. She shook Claire's hand on the dock without preamble. You sounded certain on the phone, she said. In my experience, people who are certain at midnight are either deluded or correct. I drove to the terminal at 5 this morning to find out which. And, Claire said. Reese looked at the cabin up the slope, then at the island around them, then back at Claire. Ask me again in a few hours. They went down to the underground room together while Noah sat at the table above them, working through math problems from a workbook Claire had found on Earl's shelves. Claire had explained to him the previous evening that a woman was coming to look at what Earl had gathered and that this was the next step in the process of deciding what to do. Noah had listened carefully and asked 2 questions. The first was whether the woman could be trusted. The second was whether Holbrook knew she was coming. Claire had said she believed yes to the first and no to the second. In the underground room, Reese worked in silence for nearly 2 hours. She moved along the shelves with the systematic efficiency of long practice, not browsing, not scanning, but reading with a specific purpose. She opened binders. She held photographs to the light. She uncapped two of the water sample vials and smelled them without touching the contents, then recapped them. She examined the hard drives and flash drives in their sealed bags. She stood for a long time in front of the large map on the workbench, tracing the blue pipeline lines with one finger without quite touching the paper. Claire sat on the bottom step of the staircase and waited. She had learned in the years of navigating shelters and social services offices the specific skill of waiting without performing patience, simply existing in the pause, neither anxious nor detached, present and ready. It was a skill that had cost her something to develop. Finally, Reese straightened from the map and turned around. "Your grandfather," she said, "did not simply collect evidence." "No," Claire agreed. "He built a federal case, from the ground up, alone." Reese looked at the rows of binders, the shelves of samples, the hard drives in their brackets. "In 25 years of investigative journalism, I have worked with federal prosecutors who had entire agencies behind them and did not build cases this complete." "He had time," Claire said, "and he had nothing to lose." Reese looked at her steadily. "He had plenty to lose. He had already lost it. That's a different thing from having nothing." He knew the difference. You can see it in the work the way it shifts in the early 2000s, from documentation to architecture. He stopped just recording what was happening and started building the structure that would make it actionable. That's a man who decided the work had to outlast him. Claire looked at the map. The blue lines ran through the water in their patient, damming pattern. "What happens next?" she said. Reese was quiet for a moment. "The water samples will need independent laboratory verification, chain of custody documentation, certified analysis. The financial records will need to be cross-referenced against current corporate filings. Northville has restructured at least twice since some of these documents were gathered." She paused. "The photographs are the most immediately usable element. Several show active discharge material coming out of the pipes. Not just the pipes themselves, that's not a historical record. That's ongoing criminal activity documented across multiple time periods at identified coordinates. How long will it take? To verify everything properly, months. To publish the initial story and trigger an official investigation." Reese looked at her steadily. "I can have the first piece ready within the week." Claire stood up from the step. She looked at the room her grandfather had built, the low ceiling, the careful shelves, the organized weight of 25 years, and she felt something she had not expected, which was grief. Not for Earl himself exactly, though that was present too, but for the specific quality of his solitude, for the decades of evenings in this room alone, adding another sample to the shelf, and another entry to a binder, and another piece to a case that might never be received. He had done it anyway. Every evening for 25 years, he had done it anyway. "There's something else," she said. Reese waited. "Holbrook and Decker came to the island 2 days ago, before I called you." Something shifted in Reese's expression. "Victor Holbrook. You know him." "I know of him. He runs the investment arm of a holding company with significant ties to Northville Maritime's parent corporation. He's been the intermediary in at least 2 previous situations where inconvenient information about Northville's environmental compliance was managed before it became public." A pause. "Managed is the polite word. And Decker. Roy Decker." Reese's voice went flat. "Former federal environmental investigator. Left the agency in 1998 under circumstances that were never fully explained in any official record I could access." She looked at Claire. "Earl named him." "Yes, the 1998 entry. Decker was the investigator assigned to Earl's original report. He closed the case. And he's now working directly for Holbrook." Reese shook her head slowly. "Your grandfather tracked that too, I assume." "He writes about it in the later entries, tracking Decker's movements after he left the agency, finding references to him in corporate security documentation obtained through Freedom of Information requests." Reese absorbed this. They came to buy the island. They came with a number that was too large for the property and too small for what they were actually trying to acquire. Which means they know this room exists. They know something exists. Holbrook looked at the journal when he came inside. The way you look at something you've been told about and are confirming is still there. Claire paused. Decker told me some things are better left buried. They'll come back, Reese said. I know, with more leverage and less patience. I know that too. Reese looked at her for a long moment, the direct assessing look of someone measuring not capability, but disposition. Not whether a person can do something, but whether they have made the decision to do it completely and without reservation in a way that will hold when circumstances make holding difficult. You've already decided, Reese said. It was not a question. The night I called you. Reese nodded once. Then we need to move quickly. The moment I publish the legal situation changes, they can threaten you, but they cannot suppress the story, and the regulatory agencies will be required to respond officially. The window where they have the option of making this disappear quietly closes permanently. How do we handle the data? Tonight, we copy everything, every hard drive, every flash drive, every photograph. I have a secure off-site server. You keep one complete copy here. We transmit another tonight, and I take the physical drives when I leave. We send a third copy to a lawyer I trust not for publication, just for preservation. 3 independent locations. She paused. After tonight, there is no single point of failure. Claire thought of Noah upstairs drawing his careful map of the island. She thought of him saying in his matter-of-fact way, then we need to make sure the evidence isn't only here. All right, she said, tonight. There's one more thing first. Reese reached into her canvas bag and produced a manila folder. I found something in the 2003 binders this afternoon. She opened the folder on the workbench. Inside was a printed document, a corporate filing with sections highlighted in yellow marker. Beside it in Earl's handwriting was a 2-page annotation connecting specific line items in the filing to specific entries in his sampling data. In 2003, Reese said North Vale Maritime applied for and received a coastal development permit from the State Environmental Agency. The permit was for a marine research and habitat restoration facility. It was approved by a reviewing panel that included 2 individuals with documented ties to North Vale's parent corporation. Claire looked at the highlighted sections. The permit gave them legal cover. It gave them a document they could point to in the event of any inquiry. The actual discharge activity continued and is documented in Earl's samples for every year after 2003. But the permit created a layer of official approval that would have made any straightforward prosecution significantly more difficult. Reese paused. Earl knew about the permit. He annotated it the year it was issued. And then he spent the next 20 years building documentation specifically designed to demonstrate that the permit was obtained through a process that was itself compromised. Claire looked at the annotation in her grandfather's hand, the careful connection of one piece to another, the patient architecture of an argument that accounted for every defense that would eventually be raised against it. He had known they would use the permit. He had built the case around it. She was about to step back from the workbench when something at the far end of the lowest shelf caught her attention, a section that did not align with the shelves above it. The wood at the back was set slightly forward by perhaps an inch in a way that would be invisible unless you were looking at the shelf from below and at a specific angle. She crouched. She ran her hand along the underside of the shelf board. She felt it after a moment a catch, small, spring-loaded recessed into the wood with the same deliberate invisibility as the groove in the floorboard upstairs. She pressed it. A narrow panel swung inward. Reese stepped forward and directed her phone light into the opening. Inside was a single document, a large folded sheet laminated against moisture, its folds worn from years of being opened and carefully refolded. Claire spread it on the workbench beside the pipeline map. It was a map, but not like the others. This one showed the underwater geography of the sound in precise technical detail, depths, current patterns, substrate composition at specific coordinates. And overlaid on it in red were coordinates marked with pipe diameter measurements and flow rate notations. Not just the discharge points, the exact GPS coordinates of every pipe in the system with the engineering specifications needed to locate them precisely. A map detailed enough that a recovery team could find every pipe without any additional research, without any additional anything. Earl had not just documented the crime across 25 years of careful work. He had drawn the map for the people who would clean it up. Reese looked at it for a long time without speaking. He thought of everything, Claire said quietly. He didn't leave anything to chance. Reese agreed. He couldn't afford to. She straightened. This changes the scale of the remediation that becomes possible. This isn't just a prosecution. This is a complete environmental recovery operation. Claire folded the laminated map carefully and set it beside the other documents. She looked around the room one final time, the shelves, the samples, the binders, the hard drives, the photographs, the financial records, the laminated map that her grandfather had prepared for the people who would come after him. He was extraordinary, she said. It was not something she had planned to say aloud. It arrived on its own from somewhere that had not yet learned to manage it. Reese looked at her. Yes, she said simply, he was. They worked through the afternoon and into the evening. Noah joined them after his lessons, carrying the portable hard drives up from the room one by one with focused care. Reese worked at the table with her laptop, transferring files and documenting chain of custody with methodical thoroughness. Claire organized the photographic documentation into dated sets, each cross-referenced with the corresponding water sample data and map coordinates. At some point in the late afternoon, without anyone deciding to, they fell into a rhythm. The kind that develops when people are working toward the same thing and have stopped negotiating the mechanics of it. Noah asked Reese questions while he worked careful, specific questions. Will they go to jail? Noah asked at one point, handling a flash drive by its edges. That depends on the prosecutor and the evidence, Reese said. Criminal environmental cases are complicated. Corporate lawyers are expensive and thorough. But Decker's exposure is more direct obstruction of a federal investigation, acceptance of bribes. That's cleaner legally. Grandpa knew all of that, Noah said. He wrote about it in the journal. He said he knew criminal charges might not stick to the company itself, so he gathered the financial records to make sure the individuals involved couldn't separate themselves from the decisions. Reese looked at Noah over the top of her laptop. Then she looked at Claire. He's been reading the journal, Claire said. All of it, Reese asked him. Most of it. The early parts are hard because of the science terminology, but the later parts are clearer. He got better at explaining things as he went. Reese was quiet for a moment. Your great-grandfather understood prosecutorial strategy better than most people who have law degrees. He had a long time to think about it, Noah said simply and returned to his work. By the time the island had gone fully dark, the transmission was complete. 3 separate copies of the entire archive, everything Earl had gathered across 25 years, distributed to 3 independent locations, each verified, each with a complete chain of custody document attached. Reese sealed the original hard drives back in their bags and placed them in her weatherproof case. They sat at the wooden table after the work was finished. The fire was low and warm. Outside, the sound moved against the rocks in its quiet, continuous rhythm. The map on the wall with its red circles looked different to Claire now than it had when she first arrived, less like a mystery and more like an argument, a patient, thorough, unanswerable argument that had been waiting in this room for the right moment to be made. When it publishes, Claire said, what should I expect? Reese thought carefully. Initial attention will focus on the environmental story, the dumping, the scope, the duration. That will generate pressure on the EPA and the Justice Department to open formal investigations. Northville will issue denials. They'll question the chain of custody on the evidence, which is why the documentation we've done tonight matters. A pause. They will almost certainly attempt to discredit you personally. Your history, the financial difficulties, the housing situation will be presented as evidence that you cannot be relied upon as a credible source. Claire received this without visible reaction. She had thought it through the previous night and arrived at the same place she always arrived when she thought a hard thing through completely. The evidence stood entirely on its own, requiring nothing from her credibility except the act of bringing it forward. The samples were dated and analyzed. The photographs were geolocated and time-stamped. The financial documents were sourced from public filings. None of it needed her to be believable. It needed her to be present. She could be present. Let them try, she said. That night, Claire could not sleep. She lay in the narrow back bedroom and listened to the island. The wind had picked up after dark, moving through the tall pines with sustained pressure. The cabin held against it with the solidity of good construction, the deep creak of old timber settling against the force outside but holding. She was thinking about the hours between now and Thursday when Reese's story would publish. She had thought about it many times over the past 3 days, trying to see it clearly, rather than through the distortion of either fear or hope. She had spent 3 years becoming very good at seeing things clearly. What was actually in front of her, assessed accurately, was this. She was 38 years old. She had a child who was 10 years old and who had demonstrated in the past week a capacity for calm and courage that exceeded most adults she had known. She was living on an island that legally belonged to her, with a cabin in serviceable condition and firewood stacked for the winter. She had in her possession, in this room and in two other secured locations, 25 years of documented evidence of environmental crimes that had caused measurable damage to a section of coastline she could see from her front porch. And she had a grandfather she had never met, who had watched her life from a distance and concluded that she was the right person to receive the thing he had spent his second lifetime building. That was what was in front of her. She fell asleep before midnight for the first time in longer than she could accurately remember, without the specific low-grade anxiety that had been her companion every night for 3 years. Reese left on the morning ferry. She and Claire stood on the dock while Fenn idled the engine. "The first piece will publish Thursday," Reese said. Her face was its usual composed, direct expression, but there was something underneath it that Claire recognized, the particular energy of a journalist who has found the thing they have been looking for and is moving toward the moment of it with controlled urgency. "Will you call me before it goes live?" "The night before." Reese paused. "Claire, what you're doing is right. I want to say that plainly because in the weeks ahead, there will be many voices saying many things, and I want you to have heard it said plainly at least once." Claire looked at the water. The morning was clear, the kind of November morning that occasionally follows a windy night, the air scrubbed and bright, the sound glittering under a pale winter sun. "He said it," she said, "in his letter. He said it would require courage. I think he was telling me he believed I had it." "He was right," Reese said. She stepped onto the ferry. Fenn eased the engine into gear. The boat pulled slowly away from the dock, and Claire stood and watched it go, until it was a dark shape against the bright water, and then nothing at all. Noah appeared at her shoulder. He had been standing at the top of the path, watching. "Is she going to publish it?" he asked. "Thursday." Noah nodded. He looked out at the water where the ferry had been. "What do we do until then?" "We get ready." "Ready for what?" Claire looked back up the slope at the cabin, at the dark timber, and the covered porch, and the woodshed with its careful stacks of split pine, at the island that had been for 30 years a refuge in a hidden archive and the outpost of a solitary patient war. "Ready for whatever comes after Thursday," she said. In the 2 days between Reese's departure and Thursday's publication, Claire moved through the cabin and the island with the particular quality of attention that comes when a person knows something is about to change and wants to be fully present in the quiet before it does. She repaired a loose board on the dock. She organized the cabin's kitchen, finding Earl's stored provisions, canned goods arranged by category, dried beans in labeled containers, everything inventoried with the same care he brought to his scientific records. She discovered in a drawer she had not yet opened a collection of hand-drawn maps of the island itself, the tree line, the rocky shore, the path to the dock, the small clearing on the east side where the pines thinned enough to see the open sound. Not maps for navigation, maps drawn by someone who wanted to know a place precisely. She found in the same drawer a single photograph. It was old, the paper slightly yellowed at the edges, the image slightly faded at the margins, the way photographs fade when they are handled over many years. It showed a man perhaps 45 years old standing on a dock she recognized as the dock below. He was looking at the camera with an expression she could not immediately categorize. Not quite happy, not quite sad, occupying some more complex territory between the two. He had her father's jaw. He had, she realized after a moment, her own eyes. She turned the photograph over. On the back in pencil, faint but legible, Earl Mackay, August 2001. She sat with it for a long time. Noah found her at the table. He looked at the photograph, then at her face. "Is that him?" he asked. "Yes." Noah studied the image with care. "He looks like someone who's thinking about something far away." "Yes," Claire said. "I think he was always thinking about something far away." On the evening of the second day, Wednesday, Claire was standing at the north window with a cup of coffee when she saw the boat. It came from the west, running with navigation lights that caught the surface of the water in small, moving arcs. Not gray this time, white, larger. It came into the inlet with a directness that was different from the first visit, the directness of a final move rather than an opening one. She set her coffee down. Noah, her voice was level, go to the back room, take your book, stay there until I come for you. He read her face and went without a word. She heard the boat tie up at the dock. She heard footsteps on the path more than two sets. She stood in the center of the cabin and looked at the room. The map on the wall, the shelves of books, the table, the bookshelf against the far wall with its concealed door and the locked room beneath. The room was the same. The evidence was not only in it anymore. The knock at the door was heavier than the first time, the knock of someone who has decided not to perform patience. She opened it. Holbrook was there as she had expected. His coat was the same expensive dark wool. His face was not the same. The professional warmth was entirely gone. What remained was more honest, the face of a man who has moved past the phase of the process where pleasantness is useful. Behind him stood Decker and two other men she did not recognize, positioned with the deliberate functionality of people who had been placed rather than who had chosen their positions. Miss Henson, Holbrook said, I think we need to have a more direct conversation. Come in, Claire said. He came in. The two additional men remained on the porch. Decker entered and stood near the door looking at the room with the eyes of someone returning to a place they have already assessed. Holbrook sat down at the table without being invited to. He placed his hands flat on the wood and looked at her directly. We know about the room, he said. I know you do, Claire said. She sat down across from him. Something moved in his face, a brief recalibration. He had expected more from that opening. Then you understand why we need access to what's in it. I understand why you want access to what's in it. Those aren't the same thing. Holbrook looked at his hands for a moment. When he looked up, the last residue of performance was gone. Miss Henson, the material your grandfather gathered represents a significant legal and financial liability for a number of people. Some of those people have resources that you do not have. Resources that can be applied to your situation in ways that are helpful or in ways that are not helpful, depending entirely on the decisions you make in the next few minutes. Is that a threat? Claire said. It's a description of reality. Your reality, she said, not mine. Decker moved slightly from his position near the door. Claire did not look at him. She kept her eyes on Holbrook. The evidence in that room, Holbrook said carefully, cannot be verified without a proper chain of custody. Your grandfather was not a licensed environmental investigator. His methods were not conducted under regulatory supervision. Any competent legal team would have that material excluded from proceedings before the first hearing. That's an interesting argument, Claire said. You should make it to Gwendolyn Reese. The name landed in the room with the weight she had intended, the specific quality of something that cannot be unsaid. Holbrook went very still. She was here 2 days ago, Claire said. She spent 8 hours in the room. Everything in it has been copied to 3 independent secure locations. One of those locations is a federal evidence repository submitted under the EPA's whistleblower intake protocol, which creates an automatic legal hold on any attempt to suppress or destroy the originating materials. She paused. The story publishes tomorrow morning. I moved the date up this afternoon. The silence in the cabin was total. Outside, the wind had stilled. The water was quiet. The pines stood without moving. Decker looked at Holbrook. Holbrook looked at Claire. She watched his face move through several calculations visible at a delay, the way the surface of water shows a disturbance after the stone has already gone in. She watched him arrive in sequence at the understanding that the archive was distributed, that the story was already written, that the legal hold made physical destruction of the evidence pointless, and that the window during which any of this could have been managed had closed. Had closed, she could see him understanding some time ago. Possibly the moment she had sat at this table and read her grandfather's letter for the first time. Holbrook stood up from the table. He straightened his coat. He looked at the room, at the shelves, at the map, at the journal on the table. The look of a man saying goodbye to something he had spent a long time trying to acquire and had finally understood he would never have. Miss Henson, he said. His voice was controlled and empty. Mr. Holbrook, she said. He walked to the door. Decker followed. On the threshold, Holbrook paused with his hand on the frame and she watched him consider and discard several things he might have said. In the end, he said nothing. The door closed behind them. She listened to the footsteps on the path. She listened to the dock creak under their weight. She listened to the boat engine start lower and slower this time, without urgency, the sound of retreat rather than arrival. She sat at the table and listened to the engine noise diminish across the water until the island was quiet again. And then she went to the hallway. "Noah, you can come out." He appeared in the doorway, his book in one hand, his face asking all the questions he was not yet asking aloud. "They're gone," she said. "Are they coming back?" She thought about this with the accuracy she had spent 3 years developing. About Holbrook's face when she named Reese. About the specific quality of the silence that followed. About the door closing without a final word. "No," she said, "I don't think they are." The story published at 6 the next morning. Claire read it at the table with her first cup of coffee, the phone propped against Earl's journal, Noah still asleep in the back room. Reese had written it with the precision and force of someone who had been waiting a long time for the material to match the story she knew was there. The headline was clean and direct. The evidence was laid out in a structure that moved from the concrete, the samples, the photographs, the documented discharge events, to the financial. And from the financial to the human, and from the human to the personal, and at the center of the personal was Earl Mackay, 30 years on an island building, an archive that no one had asked him to build, and no one had known he was building. And at the end of the story was Claire. Not the story she had been living for 3 years, not the park bench, not the shelter, not the 3-year erosion of everything she had built. Reese had asked her permission to include those things, and she had given it because accuracy was accuracy, and the full picture was the full picture, and the specific quality of what her grandfather had done, watching her life choosing her. Despite it choosing her because of it, required the full picture to make its complete sense. What Reese had written was a woman who had lost everything, found an island and finished a war. Noah read it over her shoulder when he woke up standing behind her chair in his socks, with his hair uncombed, his finger tracing the lines of text with the same patient attention he brought to everything. When he finished, he stood in silence for a moment. Then he said, "Grandpa would like this." "Yes," Claire said, "I think he would." In the weeks that followed, the story moved the way large, true things move, not quickly, not dramatically, but with the inexorable quality of something that has mass and momentum and cannot be redirected by the application of money or legal pressure or public denials. The EPA announced a formal investigation within 72 hours of publication. The Justice Department opened a parallel inquiry 4 days later. Northvale Maritime's stock declined sharply and continued declining. 3 former employees contacted Reese independently with corroborating information they had been holding for years, waiting for a moment when it was safe to let it go. Roy Decker retained a criminal defense attorney within a week. Victor Holbrook released a statement through corporate counsel that contained the word transparency 11 times and the word accountability 9 times and no specific admissions of any kind. Claire gave one interview. She sat across from a reporter in a room in Seattle and answered questions for 40 minutes, and she did it with the accuracy and directness that 3 years of losing everything had made possible. And when the reporter asked her at the end whether she felt vindicated, she thought about the word carefully before she answered. "I feel like something that was true for a long time is now visible," she said. "That's different from vindication. Vindication is personal. This is bigger than personal." The reporter nodded. "What will you do with the island?" Claire thought about the question. She thought about what it had been, a refuge, a hiding place, the outpost of a solitary war. She thought about what it was now, a place with evidence freely distributed and a story widely told and no more secrets requiring protection. "Keep it," she said. "We're going to keep it. Even though it's remote, even though it's difficult." Claire almost smiled. "I've been in difficult situations before. This one has better scenery." Through the fall and into winter, the island settled into a different kind of life. Scientists from the University of Washington came to take new water samples at the coordinates Earl had documented, not to gather evidence, but to begin the baseline measurement for recovery. They were respectful of the cabin, careful on the dock, and several of them asked to see Earl's original sample collection. Claire showed them the room. She watched their faces as they looked at the shelves. One of them, a woman perhaps 30 years old with the focused intensity of someone still close to the beginning of a career she had chosen very deliberately, stood for a long time in front of the water samples reading the labels. Then she turned to Claire. He was working in complete methodological isolation. No peer review, no institutional support, no standardized protocol. But look at this. She gestured at the rows of bottles. The consistency is extraordinary. He created his own protocol and held to it for 25 years without deviation. He had discipline, Claire said. He had more than discipline. The scientist paused. He had faith in the work, in the idea that the work would eventually matter. She looked at Claire. That's rare, in science and everywhere else. Claire did not answer that, but she thought about it for a long time afterward. November deepened, the days shortened. The storms came in from the northwest with the regularity they always did in this part of the Sound, and the cabin held against them the way it had held against every storm for 30 years, not without evidence of the effort, not without the particular sounds of old timber working against sustained wind, but holding, always holding. In the evenings after the day's work was done and the fire was going, and Noah was reading at the table with the focused stillness that was simply how he moved through the world, Claire would sit with Earl's journal. She had read it through twice now. She was reading it a third time more slowly, looking for things she had missed in the urgency of the first two readings. She found them. Small things mostly. Details that revealed themselves only when she was not looking for evidence, but simply reading. Reading the way you read a letter from someone who is telling you who they were. She found the entry from 2007 mid-November that began with a description of a storm very like the ones passing over the island now. Earl had written about the sound of the pines in high wind and the way the water looked from the north window when the light was failing, and the particular quality of being alone in a place that was genuinely isolated. And then at the end of the entry, a single line she had glossed over in the first reading because she had been moving quickly, looking for evidence, looking for facts. She read it now. I hope she likes it here. She looked up from the journal. Noah was at the table, one elbow on the wood, his chin in his hand, reading. The fire moved in the grate. Outside, the wind worked through the pines and the water moved against the rocks in the rhythm that had been here long before any of them and would be here long after. He had written it in 2007. She had been 20 years old then, living in a dormitory room in a college she had left before finishing her degree, working 2 jobs. He had been here, writing by lamplight, hoping. She closed the journal gently. Noah looked up from his book. He saw her expression and waited the way he always waited, present and patient, and not requiring her to perform anything she did not feel. What is it? He asked. Your great-grandfather wrote something in 2007, she said. He wrote that he hoped I would like it here. Noah considered this. He looked at the fire, then at the window, then back at his mother. Do you, he asked, like it here? Claire looked around the room, the shelves of books, the stone fireplace. The map on the wall, its red circles no longer secret, no longer dangerous. Simply the record of a man's careful work. The wooden table where she was sitting, where he had sat, where Noah sat now with his book in his elbow and his patient dark eyes. She thought about Pioneer Square in November, the bench that creaked, the specific cold, the half sandwich in the paper bag. She thought about 3 years of carrying things alone and about what it felt like to set them down. Yes, she said, I do. Noah smiled. It was the uncomplicated smile of a 10-year-old who has received exactly the answer he hoped for and is not yet old enough to conceal his relief at it. He returned to his book. The fire settled in the grate. The island held its ground against the wind. Outside, the water moved against the rocks in the dark, and the pines stood in their long rows along the shore, and somewhere beneath the floor of the cabin, the room that Earl Mackay had built held its shelves of empty spaces where the samples and the binders and the hard drives had been not gone, but distributed, dispersed into the world where they were doing what he had always intended them to do. The secret was no longer a secret. The island was no longer a refuge. It was something better than both of those things. It was a home. And on the last page of the journal, which Claire had read and then read again, and then set carefully on the shelf where she intended it to remain, Earl Mackay had written the final thing he had to say in the careful, deliberate hand of a man who understood that some words would have to carry everything that came after them. She had the words by memory now. She did not need to look at the page. Hardship builds courage, and courage is the only thing powerful men cannot buy. I leave this island to my granddaughter Claire because I watched her and I knew. And knowing was the closest thing to being there that I was allowed. The wind moved through the pines, the water moved against the rocks, the lamp above the table burned warm and steady. And in the cabin that Earl Mackay had built on the island, he had chosen not for himself but for all of them, his granddaughter sat across from his great-grandson. And the silence between them was not the silence of loss or of waiting or of things that could not be said. It was the silence of people who are exactly where they are supposed to be.